William MacDonald was born on June 17, 1924 in Liverpool, England, initially under the name Allen Ginsberg. He was the middle child of 3 siblings born into a comfortable family. Despite this material stability, the environment within the household appears to have been emotionally distant. MacDonald was described as an unusual and solitary child. Even when he was very young, he had a habit of taking long walks all by himself, sometimes even late at night. At times, these walks deeply worried his mother, and she'd have to call the police to search for him when he failed to return. Psychiatrists diagnosed him as schizophrenic while he was still young, well before his military service or his emigration from Britain. At the age of 19 in 1943, MacDonald enlisted in the British Army during the Second World War. He was assigned to the Lancashire Fusiliers, an infantry regiment of the Army. Military service would go on to have a lasting trauma over his life. While serving, MacDonald was violated one night in an air raid shelter by a corporal in his unit. The corporal reportedly threatened him with death if he ever disclosed what had happened, effectively forcing him to process the assault entirely on his own, without any support. Initially, the young soldier reacted with shame and distress. However, as time passed, his interpretation of the incident began to shift. He came to believe that he had, in fact, physically enjoyed the encounter and accepted that he might be attracted to men. This combination of trauma and identity proved psychologically catastrophic. MacDonald's military service ended in 1947, at which point he returned to civilian life in England. Almost immediately, his mental health problems resurfaced and intensified. Psychiatrists once again diagnosed him as schizophrenic, and this time the diagnosis led to formal institutionalization. His own brother made the decision to have him committed to a mental asylum in Scotland. The facility was described as straight out of the Dark Ages, with cells packed full of disturbed patients and kept in cold conditions. During his confinement there, MacDonald was subjected to electroconvulsive shock therapy on a daily basis. This treatment was administered continuously for approximately 6 months. He was eventually released only after his mother personally intervened to secure his discharge and bring him home. Separately, in the same year he left military service, MacDonald also sought help on his own accord, consulting a psychiatrist about his mental state. He reported that he was experiencing persecutory feelings, hearing strange noises in his head, and suffering from what he described as illusions. Acting on the psychiatrist's recommendation, he spent a further 3 months in a mental institution seeking treatment for these symptoms. However, this additional round of treatment produced no meaningful improvement in his condition. Following his release from the asylum, MacDonald grew increasingly open about his sexuality, which was an especially risky choice. At the time, homosexuality was a criminal offense in Britain, and the conservative moral standards of the time made any public association a source of severe social stigma. His openness brought along immediate consequences. He found himself moving from job to job as co-workers and acquaintances subjected him to taunting and ridicule once his sexuality became known. This cycle became a recurring pattern in his life. Compounding these external pressures, MacDonald grew increasingly anxious about his own stability during this period, worried that the relentless persecution he experienced was itself damaging his mental health further. By 1949, he had concluded that his environment bore direct responsibility for his ongoing psychiatric instability. Acting on this, he emigrated to Canada that year, hoping that a change of country and circumstance might resolve the turmoil he had been experiencing. In 1955, having spent roughly 6 years in Canada without achieving the life he sought, MacDonald made a second, more decisive emigration, this time to Australia. When he made this decision, it was with a deliberate motive of reinventing himself. It was also at this point that he changed his name from Allen Ginsberg to William MacDonald. In his mind, this was his way of breaking free from his identity of trauma and persecution. The reinvention, however, did not achieve the clean break he had hoped for. Shortly after his arrival in Australia, MacDonald was arrested in Adelaide on a charge of indecent assault after he touched an undercover detective's privates in a public toilet. Since homosexuality was also a crime in Australia, officers were stationed in plain clothing at restrooms known to be frequented by gay men. For this offense, MacDonald was placed on a 2-year good behavior bond rather than facing imprisonment. Following the Adelaide arrest, he relocated again, this time to Ballarat in the neighboring state of Victoria. There, he found employment on a construction site. Once again, his sexuality became known to those around him, and it triggered a violent response. MacDonald's reaction to this marked a notable escalation in his behavior. Rather than simply moving on as he had after previous incidents of harassment, he purchased a knife and slashed the tires of his attackers' bicycles. The years following this incident continued to be unstable. By 1960, MacDonald eventually made his way to Brisbane. By now, his internal urge toward violence had been steadily accumulating for years. Sometime in 1961 in Brisbane, he encountered a man named Amos Hugh Hurst outside the Roma Street railway station. Accounts differ on Hurst's exact age at the time, with some sources describing him as 55 and others as 63, but all agree he was an older man and, by most descriptions, a long-term alcoholic living a transient life. MacDonald struck up a friendship with Hurst, and the two men embarked on what is described as a long drinking session together at a nearby pub. As the evening wore on and their supply of alcohol ran low, the pair went to a hotel room that Hurst was staying in, where they continued drinking. According to MacDonald's own later account, he did not have any plans to harm Hurst, and instead, the impulse arrived suddenly and overtook him in the moment. As Hurst grew progressively more intoxicated, MacDonald began to strangle him with his bare hands, wrapping his fingers around the older man's throat and squeezing tightly. Hurst was so severely inebriated by this point that he initially failed to comprehend what was happening to him. Hurst began to hemorrhage internally, and blood surged upward from his mouth, spilling directly onto MacDonald's hands as he maintained his grip. At this point, rather than continuing to strangle his victim, MacDonald delivered a punch directly to Hurst's face. This blow proved fatal, and Hurst collapsed to the floor dead. Rather than fleeing in panic, MacDonald took the time to rearrange the scene. He lifted Hurst's body from the floor and placed it onto the bed. He then removed Hurst's pants and shoes, positioned the body, and pulled the bedsheets up over Hurst's head. MacDonald then lingered in the room for some time before finally turning off the lights and leaving. In the days that followed, MacDonald was consumed by anxiety, anticipating that police would soon connect him to Hurst's death. He described himself as being in a state of terror, expecting a knock on his door from investigating officers at any moment. Every day, he searched the local newspapers for any story reporting the discovery of Hurst's body, but for 5 consecutive days, nothing appeared. On the 5th day, he finally found a mention of Hurst, not in a crime report, but in the newspaper's obituary column. The notice stated simply that Hurst had died suddenly, with the cause attributed to a heart attack, or in some accounts, described as an accidental death. MacDonald could hardly believe what he was reading. However, what he didn't realize was that the post-mortem exam uncovered some more ambiguous truths. In it, officials identified severe bruising on Hurst's neck, but at the time, investigators ruled this as part of a prior fight, and not a direct cause of his death. Shortly after learning that Hurst's death had been ruled accidental, MacDonald purchased a knife and began actively frequenting the bars and rundown hotels of Brisbane, searching for another vulnerable victim. In a wine saloon frequented by a poorer population, MacDonald met a man identified only as Bill. As the two men drank together over the course of the evening, MacDonald began to perceive an unsettling resemblance between Bill's face and that of the army corporal who had assaulted him years earlier, a resemblance that seemed to intensify the longer they drank. At closing time, the two men took several bottles of sherry to a nearby park to continue drinking. By now, MacDonald had a powerful urge to kill Bill, but he restrained himself until he eventually passed out from intoxication on the grass. With Bill unconscious, MacDonald drew his knife from its sheath and positioned himself to strike, bringing the blade toward Bill's neck. At the last moment, however, the compulsion that had driven him abruptly faded. He returned the knife to its sheath and walked away. MacDonald later left Brisbane around June of the same year and moved to Sydney, New South Wales. He settled into an inner-city area and secured employment with the postal department as a letter sorter. For this job, he used a fake identity, registering under the name Alan Edward Brennan. East Sydney at this time contained a network of parks and public restrooms that functioned discreetly as meeting places for gay men. MacDonald quickly became a familiar, recognized presence within this community, frequenting these locations regularly. It was not long after settling into his new life in Sydney that the internal voices and compulsions that had driven his earlier killing resurfaced, urging him toward violence once again. On the night of Saturday, June 4th, he struck up a conversation with 41-year-old Alfred Reginald Greenfield, a homeless, unemployed blacksmith who was sitting alone on a park bench in Green Park, located directly across the road from St. Vincent's Hospital in the Darlinghurst area of inner Sydney. MacDonald offered Greenfield a drink from a bottle he was carrying, and the two men began drinking together. MacDonald then proposed that they go to the nearby Domain Baths, claiming that he had additional bottles of alcohol waiting there. The Domain Baths was a well-known public swimming facility on the edge of Sydney Harbour. By night, its grounds were filled with the city's homeless population and heavy drinkers. The area contained numerous alcoves and sheltered nooks that provided drinkers with some protection and cover. MacDonald and Greenfield walked to the Domain together, a journey of roughly half an hour. Upon arrival, they settled into one of the secluded corners of the grounds. Before the attack itself, MacDonald had also taken the precaution of putting on a light plastic raincoat that he had packed in his bag, anticipating the amount of blood the attack would produce. After drinking, Greenfield went to sleep, and MacDonald drew a knife and brought it down into his victim's neck. He continued stabbing until Greenfield lay motionless. With Greenfield dead, MacDonald proceeded to remove his victim's pants and underwear. He then removed Greenfield's privates with his knife. MacDonald then carried the severed organs to the water's edge and threw them into Sydney Harbour. He wrapped his bloodied knife inside the raincoat, placed the bundle in his bag, and began the walk home. Along the route, he stopped to wash the blood from his hands and face under a tap. Greenfield's mutilated body was discovered the following day, and news of the killing dominated the front pages of Sydney's evening newspapers almost immediately. The press dubbed the killer as the Mutilator. Investigators found themselves with no viable leads and no obvious motive for the killing. The nature of the mutilation initially led police toward a specific and entirely incorrect theory. They thought that the murder had been committed in a fit of jealous rage, potentially involving a romantic affair. Detectives operated on the assumption that a crime this intimate was likely done by a jealous woman who would likely turn herself in out of fear. No such person ever came forward, and despite an extensive investigation, police uncovered nothing that advanced the case. In response to the public alarm created by the killing, the New South Wales state government announced a reward valued at roughly $2,000 today for information leading to the killer's arrest. Following the murder of Greenfield, several months passed without further incident. As the investigation into the death stalled and produced no arrests, public attention gradually faded and police scaled back their active pursuit of the case. Then, on the morning of November 21st, MacDonald purchased a new knife with a 6-inch blade from the Mick Simmons sports store, located in Sydney's Haymarket district. When the clerk asked about the purpose of the purchase, MacDonald claimed he intended to use the knife for fishing. In reality, the urge to kill had returned. That same night, MacDonald was walking along South Dowling Street in East Sydney when he stumbled upon 41-year-old Ernest William Cobbin, who was staggering toward him, clearly intoxicated. MacDonald lured Cobbin to nearby Moore Park by promising alcohol. The two men made their way to a public restroom block in the park and continued drinking. MacDonald put on his raincoat, and Cobbin didn't seem to show any alarm at him doing so. With Cobbin seated on the toilet seat, MacDonald struck the first blow, stabbing into Cobbin's throat. This first strike severed Cobbin's jugular vein, and blood immediately sprayed outward, covering MacDonald's arms, face, and the raincoat he had put on moments earlier. Severely injured, Cobbin raised his arms in an attempt to defend himself as MacDonald continued his attack. Even after Cobbin had died and slumped in the toilet seat, MacDonald continued the assault, stabbing the body further until the entire cubicle was covered with blood. In total, officials stated that there were over 50 stab wounds, nearly double the wound count inflicted on Greenfield. Once Cobbin was dead, MacDonald pulled the victim's pants down and severed his privates, just as he had done with Greenfield. This time, however, he placed the severed genitals into a plastic bag, rather than immediately discarding them at the scene. He wrapped the bag and his knife together inside his raincoat, placed the bundle into his carrying bag, and calmly exited the restroom. According to one account, upon returning to his lodgings, MacDonald did not simply discard the plastic bag containing Cobbin's organs. He washed the bloody contents in warm water, moved them into a fresh, clean plastic bag, and then brought them to bed with him for the night. The following day, he wrapped the plastic bag, the murder weapon, and a brick together in newspaper, secured the bundle with string, and threw it from the Sydney Harbour Bridge into the deepest section of the harbour. The morning after the killing, police received a phone call at 5:30 a.m. from an unidentified man with a hoarse voice who said, "There's a murdered man in the toilet in Moore Park opposite the Bat and Ball Hotel." This caller was never identified. Investigators who arrived at the scene described it as unimaginably brutal. Officials discovered that Cobbin was married with 2 children, though at the time of his death, there were complications in the relationship driving him to alcoholism. Additionally, investigators found that he had no known enemies and no evident motive existed for anyone to want him dead. As with the Greenfield case, the forensic trail was virtually non-existent. Police found no fingerprints anywhere at the scene, and no witnesses came forward with any useful information. MacDonald had even wiped clean the beer bottle the 2 men had shared before the attack. In response to this second near-identical killing, police intensified their efforts substantially. They began actively staking out public toilets and other locations known to be frequented by homeless men, and they deployed undercover officers to hang among the same demographic. Police also issued a public statement intended to pressure the killer into making a mistake, saying, "We believe police pressure is forcing this murderer into the open and he could now strike anywhere at any time. We feel that any man who is alone in a lonely street or park for more than 10 minutes could be murdered and mutilated by this maniac. We believe he is a psychopathic homosexual who is killing to satisfy some twisted fantasy." For about 4 months, no further killings occurred. During this dormant period, MacDonald reviewed newspaper coverage of his own crimes with a sense of detachment, finding it difficult to fully accept that the horrifying stories being reported concerned actions he himself had carried out. He also participated in casual office conversations with co-workers who speculated about the mutilator's identity, privately getting irritated whenever colleagues described the unknown killer using derogatory terms. Due to paranoia, he became convinced for a period that his co-workers suspected him personally, and he reportedly considered turning himself in before dismissing the idea, later admitting he derived too much satisfaction from killing to give it up. By the early months of 1962, the compulsion to kill again had returned. On the morning of Saturday, March 31st, 1962, MacDonald purchased another long-bladed knife from the same sports store he had used before, packing it into his bag alongside a raincoat and a plastic bag. That night, light rain was falling over Sydney, and MacDonald wore his raincoat as he left the Oxford Hotel in Darlinghurst at around 10 p.m. There, he spotted Frank McLean, who was intoxicated, walking ahead of him down Burke Street. MacDonald followed McLean past the police station and then struck up a conversation with him and suggested that the 2 of them turn off into nearby Burke Lane to share a drink. As the pair rounded the corner into the unlit lane, MacDonald plunged his knife directly into McLean's throat. Despite his considerably larger stature, McLean's heavy intoxication left him unable to effectively defend himself. He tried to resist, but MacDonald stabbed him a second time in the face and then punched him, knocking him off balance. As McLean fell to the ground, MacDonald dropped on top of him and stabbed him repeatedly in the face and body. Mid-attack, a man walking home with his wife and child happened upon the lane and spotted what appeared to be a body lying on the ground. Hearing the voices of the approaching family and the cry of their baby, MacDonald immediately stopped the attack and hid himself nearby while the family investigated. Upon seeing McLean bleeding heavily, they left the area to seek out the police. Once the family was safely out of range, MacDonald emerged from hiding and returned to the barely alive McLean. He dragged the wounded man further into the lane, away from the street, and resumed stabbing him until he was finally dead. In total, McLean sustained 6 stab wounds across the course of the attack. With McLean dead, MacDonald carried out his now familiar ritual of severing the victim's intimate region, placing them in a bag, and carrying them home. The precision with which McLean's genitals had been removed struck investigating detectives as unusually skilled, prompting a new line of investigation. For a time, police theorized that the killer might possess a formal surgical training or at least substantial anatomical knowledge, given what appeared to be a controlled, almost clinical approach to the mutilation. This theory led investigators to place several doctors practicing in the area under investigation, none of whom ultimately produced any connection to the actual killer. In reality, MacDonald had no medical training whatsoever. The consistency of his method across multiple victims likely reflected simple repetition and practice familiarity with the act rather than any genuine surgical skill. At some point after this fourth killing, MacDonald lost his job at the postal department. Rather than try to find another job, he decided to try out his own business. He purchased a small mixed goods shop on Burwood Road in the suburb of Concord, once again registering the purchase under his alias of Alan Brennan. His plan was to sell sandwiches and various small goods from the shop while living in the rooms situated directly above it. In practice, however, he occupied this space for only about a week following his purchase deposit before his business plans took a turn. On the night of Saturday, June 6, 1962, MacDonald visited a wine saloon on Pitt Street. There, he met Patrick Joseph Hackett, a thief and drifter who had only recently been released from prison. The two men left the saloon together and returned to MacDonald's newly purchased shop, where they continued drinking. After a short period, Hackett fell asleep on the floor. MacDonald then retrieved a boning knife. He then stabbed the sleeping Hackett in the neck. The attack did not proceed as smoothly as MacDonald's previous killings. Hackett, despite the severity of the wound, woke immediately and attempted to shield himself. In doing so, he inadvertently pushed the blade back into MacDonald's own hand, inflicting a severe cut on his attacker. Rather than being deterred by his own injury, MacDonald ultimately drove the knife directly into Hackett's heart and killed him. Even after this fatal blow, MacDonald continued stabbing the body repeatedly until he was forced to stop purely from physical exhaustion. Hackett's blood was splattered across the walls and floor of the residence, and MacDonald himself ended up sitting in a pool of the victim's blood beside the body. MacDonald then attempted to carry out his customary mutilation of Hackett's privates, but by this point the blade of the knife had become significantly blunted from repeated contact with bone during the prolonged attack. He made several attempts to hack around the area, but was ultimately unable to fully sever them and gave up. Too exhausted to retrieve a second, sharper knife from downstairs in his shop, MacDonald simply remained where he sat, covered head to toe in blood, and fell asleep beside Hackett's body. When he awoke the following morning, he found himself still lying next to the corpse, his body caked in sticky, drying blood. The pools of blood from the attack had soaked through the floorboards of the upstairs residence, seeping nearly all the way down to the counter of the shop below. After cleaning himself as best he could, MacDonald went to a hospital to have his wound professionally stitched, telling the attending doctor a false story that he had cut himself while working in his shop. Once he had cleaned up as much of the blood as possible from the residence, he dragged Hackett's body and concealed it beneath the floorboards of the shop. In the days that followed, MacDonald grew increasingly paranoid, anticipating that police would inevitably come looking for the missing Hackett. He feared that if officers visited his shop to ask questions, they would notice the blood-stained floorboards and walls that he had been unable to fully clean, and that this evidence would expose him immediately. Driven by this escalating anxiety, he abandoned the shop and fled to Brisbane. Approximately 3 weeks after the killing, neighboring residents and merchants near the shop began to notice an increasingly putrid smell emanating from the closed building. The odor grew severe enough that local residents contacted the health department, which in turn alerted police. On November 20th, officers forced their way into the shop and eventually located the source of the smell by pulling up the floorboards, beneath which they discovered a severely decomposed body. The corpse was in such an advanced state of decomposition that visual identification was impossible. The autopsy had to be performed in a shed behind the hospital due to the severity of the rot, and the only conclusion the examining doctor could reach with confidence was that the body belonged to a man in his 40s. This age estimate happened to align closely with records for the shop's registered owner, Alan Brennan. strengthening the assumption that the body was MacDonald himself. Because no connection had yet been drawn between this discovery and the 3 earlier mutilator killings, investigators proceeded under the assumption that the decomposed body was that of the missing shop owner Alan Brennan. Believing Brennan to be dead, the body was buried on hospital grounds and a formal obituary notice was published. This obituary was read by MacDonald's former colleagues at the Postal Department, several of whom went on to attend a small memorial service. At the time these events were unfolding, the real MacDonald had settled into life in Brisbane. However, his fears soon proved to be too great and he decided to relocate further into New Zealand. Despite battling this anxiety, his drive to kill kept intensifying. At one point, he felt compelled to return to Sydney specifically in order to act on it. When he did decide to return to Sydney, MacDonald crossed paths entirely by chance with a former postal co-worker named John McCarthy, a man who had personally attended MacDonald's memorial service. Shocked, he said, "I believed you had died." MacDonald, unaware at this point that the police had misidentified Hackett's body as his own, simply replied, "Leave me alone," before turning and fleeing the area. Shortly afterward, he left Sydney for Melbourne. McCarthy, shaken by the encounter, went directly to the police to report what he had seen. His account was initially dismissed, and officers accused him of having had too much to drink and told him to go home and sleep it off, with some going so far as to suggest he was simply crazy. Undeterred, McCarthy returned to the police station the following day to press his case again, but was once more turned away without being taken seriously. Frustrated by the police's refusal to investigate, McCarthy took his story to the Daily Mirror newspaper, where he spoke with reporter Joe Morris. McCarthy recounted in detail how he had encountered the man he knew as Alan Brennan, who was supposedly dead and buried, walking the streets of Sydney very much alive. Morris judged the account credible and ran the story under the headline, "Case of the Walking Corpse." The resulting public attention forced police to finally take action. They exhumed the body buried under Brennan's name, and fingerprint analysis of the remains revealed conclusively that the corpse did not belong to Brennan at all, but was instead that of Patrick Hackett. A closer forensic examination of the body at this stage revealed multiple stab wounds and evidence of attempted genital mutilation, physical characteristics that immediately linked the case to the 3 earlier unsolved mutilator killings. For the first time, investigators understood that the man they had been calling Brennan was, in fact, both a living fugitive and very likely the elusive Sydney mutilator himself. Following the revelations, Sydney police obtained an identikit composite image intended to represent MacDonald's likeness, based on descriptions provided by his past co-workers. By this point, MacDonald had already relocated to Melbourne, where he secured employment as a porter with the Victorian railway system. To further conceal his identity, he adopted the name David Allen. Furthermore, he took active steps to physically disguise his appearance, dyeing his hair and growing a mustache. Despite these efforts, MacDonald's cover did not hold. Former workmates and colleagues at the railway recognized him almost immediately upon seeing the circulated image and photographs. Authorities were alerted, and police arrived at the railway station to take him into custody at the moment he had come to collect his weekly wages on May 13, 1963. Once in custody and under questioning, MacDonald gave a largely unprompted confession. He admitted outright to the killings, attributing them directly to what he described as an irresistible urge to kill. He told investigators that he had been the victim of an assault as a teenager and explained that he felt compelled to disempower victims that he selected essentially at random as a form of displaced revenge for that original trauma. He also told police that he heard voices in his head that identified his chosen victims as the corporal who had assaulted him during his military service years earlier. His trial began in September 1963 and quickly became one of the most sensational criminal proceedings in Australian history. He pleaded not guilty on the grounds of insanity and testified in graphic detail about each killing. The testimony was so disturbing that several jurors fainted and had to be escorted from the courtroom. 3 psychiatrists testified in support of an insanity defense, yet the jury returned a guilty verdict anyway, a decision that reportedly surprised expert psychiatric observers given the weight of evidence pointing to serious mental illness. Judge Justice McLennan described it as the most barbaric case of murder and disregard for human life he had encountered in his career. MacDonald showed no remorse, stating plainly that he would continue killing if given the opportunity. He was sentenced to 5 consecutive life terms, with a strong judicial recommendation that he never be released. He was initially held at Long Bay Hospital, a psychiatric division of Long Bay Correctional Center, and was subsequently certified insane and transferred to a secure mental facility before eventually returning to the mainstream prison system. Within the prison, he was known simply as Bill and became so institutionalized over the decades that he emerged as the longest continuously serving inmate in New South Wales history. In 2003, MacDonald stated publicly that he had no interest in ever living outside prison again, remarking, "I have no desire to go and live on the outside. I wouldn't last 5 minutes." He also admitted that his violent urges had never fully subsided and that he could have killed more men had circumstances allowed. At age 90, MacDonald died of a gastrointestinal blockage on May 12, 2015 at Prince of Wales Hospital in Randwick while still in custody.